Hi, everybody. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're going to just, my name is Todd. I'm manage Phoneix Books in Burlington. Just for the people that are here on time, I appreciate that. And we're just going to wait maybe a minute or two more and just let people filter in as they can navigate all this new technology for some people maybe. Alan, where are you now? Where's your house at?
Well, I'm actually not at my house because I have such terrible internet. I had to go to a friend's house in Montpelier.
Okay.
That increased my internet speed by a factor of 10.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's pretty bad out in Worcester. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, normally I live in Worcester, a dozen miles north of Montpelier.
Okay. I was just out your way over the weekend. We did a big fall foliage tour. Drove out 15 and all the way out to Route 14 and down and around.
Oh, well, you had a good weekend. It was pretty well peaked this past weekend.
It almost looked like it was past peak up, when we were up by Hardwick.
That very well might be true, yeah, because we're now past peak, and I think it peaked around us Thursday, Friday, Saturday last week. After a while, it gets kind of relative what beautiful is,
No, that's true. Everybody's getting their moment in the sun here. Michelle, is that you doing that?
No.
Yeah, I was going to say, who's doing that? Are we being trolled by somebody?
Not that I can tell. Let's see.
Oh, now it's on Michelle.
Things are really jumping around.
Let's go back.
All right, so I think, what do you think, Michelle? We get going?
Yep.
All right. Well, welcome again to everybody. And for those of you who didn't see me earlier tonight, my name is Todd. I manage Phoneix Books in Burlington. And we are really happy to have you here tonight for a really great event with Allen Gilbert. Before we get going on that, I just want to go over some housekeeping things for everybody. We're going to be recording this event and it will be posted on our social media sometime in the future. So check our social media for that. We are trying something new tonight, and actually everybody that comes in is muted, and you cannot unmute yourself for this event tonight. If you would like, when we have the question and answer period, you can raise your hand like that, or there are a couple ways you can do that electronically as well. You can use Alt-Y. Oh, hey, look, here's some handy Zoom tips for you all. Thanks, Michelle. This is so great. So you can see that there's you can use the chat function there to ask your question if you'd like. If you didn't want to actually speak. If you wanted to raise your hand all the way on the bottom left, you can do your raise hand thing and then we'll call on you and unmute you and then you can ask your question. So that's really awesome. Thanks, Michelle. That was really helpful. All right, so we are here tonight with Allen Gilbert. Allen was the executive director for the ACLU of Vermont for 12 years, from 2004 until 2016. And before that, he was in journalism, worked both as an editor and a reporter. And he's taught writing around our state as well. And just a real shout out to Allen's work for the ACLU. A really, really, really important organization, really protects everybody. And I want to thank him for his service there. And this book is called, his new book is called Equal is Equal, Fair is Fair. The subtitle is Vermont's Quest for Equity in Education Funding, Same-Sex Marriage, and Healthcare. It's paperback, it's $12.99. It's available from our website, phoneixbooks.biz. Michelle, I'm sure we'll be sending you a link as well that can help you figure out how to purchase this book. We're also really excited about this book because this is one that Allen worked with us to produce. Phoneix Books has a self-publishing arm called Onion River Press, and that has helped, I'm going to say more than 60, Rachel, just nod if that's the right number. Probably more than that, 60 Vermont authors get their books published through Onion River Press.
We have at least 4 dozen books in print.
Yeah, we're really happy and excited about being able to help our neighbors and people from our community get their books in a printed form. And it's been really fun to work with all these people. And I want to thank Allen for working with us on this one. And like I said, it's available from phoenixbooks.biz. All right. And did we lose Allen again? There he is.
Am I here? Okay.
So without any further ado, I am going to turn this on over to Allen. Allen is going to talk to you a little bit about his book, and then read some passages from a couple of the sections of the book to give you a sense of that. And then we're definitely going to have a time for questions and answers. So you can either, if you have a question, you can use the chat function and just get the question out there. And then when it's time, we'll ask that. When we have the question and answer period, again, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you if you want to speak. So thanks everybody once again for coming. Thanks Allen for such a great book. And I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here tonight. I hope everybody is having fewer computer problems than I'm having. My elderly computer seems to be jumping around, starting programs behind me here and there. I'm hanging on though. So I wasn't quite sure how to introduce this book to people, because it does have a lot of information about some pretty weighty subjects that have come up in Vermont in the last 20, 30 years. But it does that because when I left the ACLU in 2016, I realized I had really gathered a boatload of questions about this notion of equity and how people get treated fairly. And it wasn't just while I was working at the ACLU. I also, in the other jobs I had before in journalism and then also in teaching, both of those areas also have kind of an equity core to them. So when I retired and had some time, I thought I'm going to dig into the three big issues that have preoccupied Vermont in the last 30 years. The first one being the move to reform education funding, how that was done. The second one being same-sex marriage rights. And then the third one being trying to bring universal publicly funded healthcare to Vermonters. And that one, is, we all know who live in Vermont, has been a slog, and that still hasn't been achieved, but people have been working on it for a long time, which is one of the things I'll talk about a little bit later. I learned a lot of stuff in doing the research, stuff that surprised me, because I thought as a journalist I had uncovered a lot of different corners that other people hadn't been able to investigate. But the more I dug into the history of these three issues, the more I realized some of this stuff is not new, that what we're going through, particularly in healthcare, is not an issue, is not a challenge that hasn't been looked at by Vermonters long before us, 100 years before us, as a matter of fact. That's how long healthcare reform has been going on. I found the same thing with education funding. There were governors back in the 1880s and 1890s talking about the lack of equity in funding for schools around the state. We actually had a property tax, a statewide property tax for schools starting in 1890 that lasted up until 1930. So some of the things that happened in the 90s and things that we're still dealing with now really do have a long, long history. And that surprised me. I didn't realize how we were not exceptional in the sense of these were completely new challenges. I think the one new challenge was same-sex marriage. And as we know, Vermont was a leader in that, which everybody I think should be proud of. And I'm going to talk a fair amount about that because the legal decision in that Chief Justice Jeffrey Amestoy wrote is very interesting from a number of perspectives. So early on in the research, I had a really happy surprise. I found that the Common Benefits Clause in the Vermont Constitution, which is what provided the legal basis for both the Brigham lawsuit and also the Baker lawsuit, the Common Benefits Clause, the language actually comes from the state where I was born and grew up, and that's Pennsylvania. I know Pennsylvania often gets a bad rap these days, sometimes for good reason, but in the 1600s and 1700s, it was one of the most, if not the most progressive state, and also the most inclusive state, colony, I should say, I'm sorry, the most inclusive colony of any of the 13 British colonies in America. And it was largely because of its foundation, its formation by William Penn, who had gotten a grant of land from the King of England The Penn family had been owed money. They had lent money to the king to finance goodness knows what. The king technically owned the land or a good deal of the land in North America, according to English law, right? But in order to pay off the Penn debt, the Penn family accepted land, and the land was what became the state of Pennsylvania. William Penn, was a Quaker who actually spent some time in the Tower of London because his views were considered radical and not acceptable to how the crown felt various issues should be dealt with, shall I say. And he ended up taking the grant of land in Pennsylvania and setting up a colony that was to be open to everybody. And he particularly stressed religious tolerance. As a Quaker, he felt that all faiths should be welcomed. So unlike Massachusetts, where you had a lot of repression of all kinds of people, particularly people who were not Puritans religiously, Pennsylvania was sort of way ahead of the crowd. What they did in the 1770, after the Declaration of Independence declared the colonies free states, each state had to set up its own constitution. And the Pennsylvania Constitution was one of the first ones that was set up. When Vermont wanted to become the 14th state, which that campaign to become a state actually started in 1777, the Vermonters went to Philadelphia to meet with the Congress, and Congress said, no, you're not ready to become a state. And the Vermonters, Ethan Allen and company, were a little bit bemused by this, and they ended up talking with a guy by the name of Dr. Thomas Young. So let me read you from the book how it was that our Constitution is basically the Pennsylvania Constitution from 1777. Vermont's copying, and I really do mean copying, of the Pennsylvania language in its Constitution was no coy theft or unintended plagiarism. The state's founders specifically wanted their Constitution to be nearly identical to that of Pennsylvania. The founders' decision was a tactical one, based on the advice of a friend and mentor of Ethan Allen, Dr. Thomas Young of Philadelphia. Young was recognized as an astute observer of the politics of the young nation. When a delegation from Vermont failed in 1777 to persuade the Continental Congress to recognize Vermont's petition for statehood, Young agreed to meet with the delegates to strategize about how to make a better case the next time they appeared before Congress. Young said Vermonters needed to show they were ready and able to form a working government and to be accepted as the new country's 14th state. The first step, he said, was to develop a constitution. He suggested the recently passed Pennsylvania Constitution as a model. It was widely regarded as the most progressive of all the state's constitutions. The Vermonters wisely followed his advice. They copied entire sections of the Pennsylvania Constitution to affirm the values they were told the most respected thinkers of the time held and which they shared. Other states actually did the same thing, but their constitutions were later amended, as was Pennsylvania's original constitution. And with that, the boldness of the Revolutionary War era language was diluted, or even in some cases, it was eliminated. Not so with the Vermont Constitution. Our Constitution is actually the least amended of any state constitution in the country. We are still governed by progressive language on individual rights written in the immediate afterglow of the colony's break with Great Britain. So what exactly does the Common Benefits Clause say? The clause states that government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit and security of the people, nation, or community, and not for the particular emolument or advantage of any single man, family, or set of men who are a part only of that community. So to put it in more simple terms, when government provides a benefit to its citizens, it has to provide it on an equal basis. And that's exactly what both the Brigham and the Baker cases were decided on. Government, in the case of education, was providing it to all students. Therefore, it had to be provided on an equal basis. The claim in the Brigham case was financial inequity. School districts had different access to levels of funding based on their own local tax bases. And the Supreme Court found that that was unconstitutional based on the common benefits language because as the court famously said, a child's education should not depend on the mere fortuity of his residence, which is really what was happening. What I'd like to do is to read you each of my chapters, by the way. I have a chapter on education funding, a chapter on same-sex marriage, a chapter on health. Each of them begins with a profile of a person or several people. And the reason I did that is because behind every reform effort, be it something that's backed up by the law, a lawsuit, or whether it be people who meet and pass resolutions and form organizations, there are always people, often very specific people, who are connected with the movement. And for me, I think the person who is most connected to the Brigham decision is indeed Amanda Brigham. So let me just read you what I wrote about Amanda. Behind every legal case is a person and a story. The school funding case filed in 1995 in Vermont Superior Court in Hyde Park was Brigham v. State of Vermont. Although there were 13 plaintiffs, the lead plaintiff was Amanda Brigham. Her surname came first alphabetically in the list of plaintiffs, and so the file created by the court was Brigham. I always felt it was fitting that a lawsuit that broke new legal ground in an important education issue took the name of an 8-year-old. Once the Vermont Supreme Court decision in the case was handed down 2 years later, legislators explaining a school funding issue began to say that Brigham requires this, or Brigham doesn't allow that. I smiled to think how appropriate it was that a child from a rural Addison County farm town seemed to be telling adults what to do when it came to education. Amanda was the daughter of Carol and Rusty Brigham of Whiting, a hardworking couple who struggled to keep the family farm going, but ended up having to work off the farm as well to make ends meet. Carol served on the Whiting School Board. She knew how hard it was to balance the school's budget. The town was property poor and residents' incomes were below the state average. There was nothing fancy about the small school in the village that served kids in kindergarten through 6th grade. Amanda was squirming in a decidedly adult-sized chair when I first met her in the summer of 1995 at the Lamoille County Courthouse. Her mother introduced us, explaining that my school was also involved in the lawsuit. We were a plaintiff like her. Amanda said hello after prompting from her mom. Carol whispered to me that she was shy. I tried to put myself in her shoes, pondering what it would be like if my mother and I had one day gotten into our car and driven 85 miles from the small town where I was growing up to attend something called a hearing to change things so schools work better for all kids. It's hard to know how much any 8-year-old can understand of a complicated legal case. There was something about the way Amanda squirmed that late summer day, however, her feet unable to touch the courthouse's wooden floor, but her eyes roaming the school-like room with the judge's bench, the lawyers' tables, and rows of seats, that told me she may not now understand what was happening, but at some point in the future, she would. She'd know she was part of history that day. I kept up with Amanda over the years and also with Carol, and I can tell you that she's a very capable, very knowledgeable young woman who understands what her role was. And she's proud of it, but she really doesn't wear on her sleeve the notoriety that was awarded simply by the alphabet. She's living in Northfield and works at Norwich, had worked at Norwich University, and is a wonderful kid. So that's education funding. Let's quickly go on to same-sex marriage. That one's an interesting one because I think we all know that Vermont led the way in having the first judicial ruling that same-sex couples were entitled to the same benefits that married straight couples have. There was a big disappointment, however, in the Baker decision because the court did not order that gay couples immediately be able to get marriage licenses from JPs or ministers or whoever was marrying them. Instead, the court said the legislature knows what the job is. They have to make sure that gay couples can have the same marriage benefits as straight couples, but it's up to the legislature to actually come up with a system for making sure that that works. It was a difficult task, and I think the court got blamed for not making it easier for the legislature. But there actually, I found out, was a method to what some may have thought of as the madness of the court. And that had to do with how a judicial decision in a very controversial area and an issue and feelings that were very much in flux at the time, how the court can best ensure that the goal it's setting can be achieved. One of the things I realized when I started this project and I went back and I reread the Baker decision is that only 1/3 of the Baker decision actually deals with marriage. The other 2/3 is all about the decision the court itself is making, how it reached the decision, and how moving forward in the future, the Common Benefits Clause should be applied. Chief Justice Jeffrey Amistoy, who had only recently been appointed to the court when the decision came out in 1999, he was the one who wrote the decision. And he actually was chosen randomly. I thought originally that he had decided for himself he was going to write the decision because he thought it was important that he do so. But it turns out he actually was randomly chosen by a system that the court had in place as to which of the justices would write a decision. And Amistoy just happened to draw it. When you go back and read that decision now, it's really, you realize what was going on was a much deeper level of strategizing than I ever thought of at the time. The court was trying very, very hard to set up the circumstances for how not only a law could be passed that would grant same-sex couples the same benefits of marriage as straight couples got, but it was also trying to set a path for how the decision and the law that would follow would be accepted by the majority of Vermonters. If you were around Vermont in the late 90s, early 2000s, and you remember the really intense fight over the same-sex marriage issue, the Take Back Vermont signs, the large demonstrations around the State House, the busing of people from churches and so forth to come and testify, or to large public hearings in the well of the House, they were pretty, they appeared to be very divisive times. What the court did, and it was really Jeff Amistoy writing the majority opinion, did was to use what he called constitutional pragmatism. And by that, he was arguing for a way of a court not necessarily imposing action that must be taken, but having the legislative body and the population generally figure out the best way to handle it. And I was struck last week when I was reading the obituary for Ruth Bader Ginsburg that she had actually not thought that the Roe v. Wade decision was a good decision. She felt the court was moving too fast at that time and that it would not be accepted by the public. And she counseled, she wasn't on the court then at that time, of course, but she, when she talked about the case as late as the early 90s before she got in the court, she said that she thought the court had moved too fast and that it wasn't going to be accepted. So what was happening in the states was the states judges, Supreme Courts were becoming much more active in how they looked at cases involving civil rights. That was particularly true after the era Warren Court sort of fell apart in the 70s, and the really big pushes for protection of individual rights, from discrimination, racial discrimination, to voting rights. That era was ending, and people started turning to the states to try to find constitutional bases for rights that people were arguing that they held. And that was happening in Vermont. The Brigham case was the first time that the Common Benefits Clause had been applied in such a way to force a resolution to a really difficult issue. The Baker decision was the second, And the court didn't have to spend as much time describing the common benefits clause that it had in the first decision, the Brigham decision, but it did kind of have to explain why it was taking the tack that it was taking. So in my book, I write about this thing called pragmatic constitutionalism. And let me read you a bit that it is some things that Jeffrey Amistory, the Supreme Court Justice who wrote the opinion, said. He said, at the root of pragmatic constitutionalism, there is a recognition that courts may not always have the right answer in responding to issues fraught with sharp political edges. In state constitutionalism, Amistory wrote, both law and politics matter. He then noted an observation made by a Professor Cass Sunstein that was quoted in the Baker decision, and that was, when a democracy is in moral flux, courts may not have the best or the final answers. Judicial answers may be wrong. They may be counterproductive, even if they're right. Courts do best by proceeding in a way that is catalytic rather than preclusive, and that is closely attuned to the fact that courts are participants in the system of democratic deliberation. Then he described how a court can become part of a democratic deliberation. He said, if one accepts, and I understand there are those who don't, the premise that sound state constitutionalism must acknowledge that judicial authority is not ultimate authority, then a paramount objective of a judicial opinion must be persuasiveness. By persuasiveness in this context, I mean more than the analytic rigor and sound legal reasoning that one should expect from a competent appellate court engaged in state constitutional interpretation. And I mean something other than a contribution one hopes a state constitutional opinion like Baker may make to a national dialogue about equality. The opinion must, in its use of history, text, analysis, and language, resonate with those who, to return to what he calls an architectural analogy he had used earlier, it must resonate with those who live in the house and have the power to alter it. He went on to say at the end of the article, whatever Baker's ultimate fate is a statement of independent state constitutional jurisprudence, the experience of the Vermont community in responding to the opinion does demonstrate, I believe, that by conscious choice of language and analytic structure, a state appellate court may either arrest or advance the public debate, even in such highly charged issues as same-sex marriage. In concluding that extending benefits and protections of marriage to the plaintiffs, when simply all is said and done, a recognition of our common humanity, the Baker opinion was intended to resonate with every Vermonter. For in our constitutional system, every Vermonter is a participant and we all live in the same house. We will know we have built well when, in the words of the poet, quote, underneath that roof, there was no distinction of persons, but one family only, one heart, one hearth, and one household. The poet is Longfellow, and he's quoting, Amistory was quoting from Tales of the Wayfarer Inn, I think it is. It's an astounding history lesson that I think we all as Vermonters would be benefited from if we read it every so often, to sort of remember what this common benefit stuff is all about and what the court was trying to do when it was making its decision in the Baker case. And then last, let me read you a part from the healthcare section of the book. I think so far in talking about the book with people, I've gotten more questions about healthcare than any of the other issues. And that's sort of to be expected. One, we're in the middle of a pandemic, or we hope it's at least the middle, if not further. And healthcare is also the issue that's been discussed about and argued about and hasn't been resolved than any of the other issues. Vermont has literally been discussing healthcare since the early 1920s. So what's been happening in the last 20, 30, 40 years, in some ways, if we knew history better, we shouldn't be surprised about it. On the other hand, it's incredibly frustrating, and it's still an open question, I think, is when we are going to actually get to the point of universal access. I wanted to read you the section that I write about that is the demise of the first major effort to establish a uniform, universal healthcare, public access, publicly funded for everybody in Vermont. And that came in 1994, after there had been the Vermont Healthcare Authority, which had been set up during the Snelling administration, and it was charged with coming up with some plans for setting up the kind of system I just described. The legislature in 1994 was considering one of those plans, and it was indeed a single payer plan. The government was going to be running the financial show. And the person in charge of shepherding this bill, certainly at least through the House, was Ralph Wright, who, if you were around at that time, you have a sense of probably where all this is going and what this is going to be like. In 1994, Speaker Wright stood before his party's House caucus at the start of the week when a comprehensive reform bill, the outcome of the healthcare authority's work, would be taken up. The previous week, Wright had counted 88 votes in favor of a sweeping single-payer system, a dozen more than needed for House passage. Wright himself wasn't wedded to the plan, and Howard Dean, the governor, was felt to be lukewarm to cool on single-payer. What both wanted, though, was universal coverage. It seemed they should at least be able to get that. There was such a margin that was willing to reach for even the tougher goal of single payer. Wright was worried, though. He would later write in his autobiography, All Politics is Personal, things weren't looking very good for the issue we had put so much of our time and energy into over the past 2 years, and we were barely hanging on to the smallest semblance of the revolutionary measure that had struck such excitement in our hearts 2 years earlier. Time, cost, and complexity of the issue had been our greatest enemy. Joining these three opposing forces, that is time, cost, and complexity, to create Wright's pre-vote jitters, were lurking critics such as Harry and Louise. Harry and Louise were two middle-aged, middle-class TV citizens scripted in a national ad campaign launched in 1993 to undermine the national healthcare initiative of the newly inaugurated President Bill Clinton. The Vermont plan, championed by Dean, suffered collateral damage from the national angst over comprehensive reform. Between the Wednesday of the week when Wright had taken his head count, showing 88 House members in favor of a universal single-payer plan, and the Tuesday of the pre-vote caucus, opponents had, quote, pulled out all the stops, realizing Vermont just might be small enough, even innocent enough, to do the right thing and provide a universal health plan for all its citizens, unquote. Wright related it in his autobiography. The Democrats had to admit Wright said that we were David without the slingshot. Member after member came up to him or his legislative healthcare point person, Representative Sean Campbell, and said they could no longer support a shift to a state-run universal health plan. It, and not just the single-payer element, was too radical. Seeing that he no longer held the votes to pass the plan, Wright settled for a watered-down version and the hope that he and the governor could revive a universal coverage plan in the Senate. I never dreamed of giving up, Wright wrote. It wasn't in me. Besides, we still might pull it all together. For even though we didn't have a majority of Democrats in the Senate, the public demand still seemed to be there, and we had the doctor governor who had gotten this whole thing started. It wasn't to be. Quote, we were 10,000 feet above New Jersey when the end came, unquote, Wright explained. He and Dean were flying to Washington for a political fundraiser. Dean was calmly reading the New York Times. Wright turned to him and said, Governor, what are we going to do with the healthcare plan in the Senate? Wright noted Dean's response in one sentence. He barely looked up from his reading and he nonchalantly answered, nothing, it's dead. Dead? Excuse me. 22 years later, when Wright penned the book, he was still fuming over Dean's death pronouncement. He wrote rhetorically, that's it? It's dead? 2 years of grinding and fighting and it's dead? Everything went out of my mind as the only visual I had was the governor in a hospital room, pulling another sheet up over a patient's face and turning to look at the charts on the patient in the next bed. The same story would play out 20 years later, and that's the irony of this, albeit on the ground in a much more public space. Another governor would pronounce another comprehensive healthcare reform effort, one based on a single-payer model, dead. But instead of a distraught House Speaker mourning defeat in the solitude of an airplane high above New Jersey, this time an angry coalition of advocates would shut down formal legislative proceedings at the State House, drawing the ire of the legislators. The subtitle for the next part of this chapter is Shumlin Promises He'll Deliver. So that's where the book goes from there. The rest of the chapter on healthcare tries to look at all the attempts that had been made over many years, including the last 10 years, 5 years, and to sort of sum up where we are now. And the equation still doesn't get us to where I think almost everybody knows we ought to be, but we haven't figured out a way to get there. So the epilogue of the book is trying to figure out what's ahead for the third issue in these three different issues I've looked at. Why were we able to succeed in the first two and not in this third? The obvious answer is that we succeeded in the first two because of the constitutional imperative that was put to life, came back to life through by the lawyers' efforts in the Baker and the Brigham cases. With healthcare, there hasn't been a constitutional claim that anybody has found that can be made for a universal right to healthcare. There's only one group of people in this country who have been found to have a constitutional right to healthcare, and that's prisoners, people in jails. And that's based on a decision from the 1980s that involved an inmate in a Texas jail who was harmed when he was working. He was on work detail, and a 600-pound bale of cotton landed on him, and he was seriously injured, and all doctors gave him were a couple of aspirin. He ended up suing on his own behalf. He represented himself, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall wrote the main opinion. It was an 8-1 decision, and it said prisoners who were in the custody of the state, of government, have a right to health care. So if you are a prisoner, you actually have a constitutional right to health care. It's unlike any other group of people, including the general public, throughout the country. So I think in the years ahead, healthcare is clearly going to be an issue that's not going away. I think the pandemic has put new emphasis on the fact that it really is to everybody's benefit when everybody in our state is healthy and has health care. We know we spend more money in this country than any other country on a per capita basis for results that are no better and in many cases not as good as other countries. And we know that Vermont actually spends more than the US national average. So we're sinking a lot of money into a system that almost everybody agrees just isn't working as well as it should. So with that, my camera beginning to go on and off, I'll stop.
So we'll turn it over for questions now. And we do have one in the chat from Deb. She says, Alan, wonderful book. I was wondering while reading it, whether you think it's possible to make a case for healthcare as a right using the proportional burden clause, Article 9 of Chapter 1, to make a use for single payer. I say this because Vermonters who are denied Medicaid because they make a few dollars over Medicaid eligibility. Yet if they become ill and have no insurance, they may lose their health or life, even all the while paying taxes which contribute to others getting healthcare coverage. Is this worth exploring?
Yeah, I do think it's worth exploring. And for those of you who don't know what this Article 9 proportional burden clause is, it's a clause in the state constitution that says all citizens must bear a proportional burden of the costs of running the state. So in other words, taxes have to be fair. There has to be a fair proportioning of the expenses of government, be it law enforcement or schools or possibly healthcare. There was actually a claim in the Brigham case, a proportional burden claim that was made as well. It, along with the common benefits claim, were the constitutional claims on the table. What happened was the Brigham lawyers, there were a team of them led by Bob Ginsburg. When they won the case on the common benefits clause, the court said, well, you still have this second claim out there, the proportional burden claim, but the state did not brief it adequately enough when it brought the case before us, the Supreme Court. So if you want to pursue litigating that claim, we'll have to send it back to the Superior Court, the lower court, and have argument in that, and then likely have to decide that after the lower court arguments are made, and it comes back up to us if on appeal. And at that point, the Brigham lawyer said, you know, we got a pretty big win here. Do we really want to spend time and possibly jeopardize what we've already won? Why don't we accept the common benefits win, and proportional burden is going to be an issue for another day. So Deb's right. There is a clause out there that nobody has really brought successfully to try to make the issue of who pays for what service government is providing in a more proportional basis in terms of income or assets or whatever. And I think it would be an interesting claim. I have to state, I'm not an attorney. I spent a lot of time on these issues when I was involved in the Brigham case. My school district, Worcester, was one of the plaintiffs. And then obviously when I worked at the ACLU, we worked on a lot of constitutional questions. And I kept a watch over the Brigham decision when I was at the ACLU. But healthcare has been a really tough one. And I remember Deb, and I think this is Deb Richter who's asked the question. It's a great one. We even had a meeting with Bob Ginsburg back in the early 2000s because Deb wanted to know, and I wanted to know, if he saw any hooks that we could use to bring a lawsuit on trying to get universal healthcare. And at that point, he said, you know, a lot of us have looked at this, and we just can't find the hook that might be there. So we got to keep working on it. I think one of my main messages from the book is that, you know, we don't have to wait for a court to tell us what we know we should be doing. I mean, we all know that everybody in the state should have healthcare. I mean, everybody in the country should have healthcare, for goodness sakes. That's true in most countries around the world, certainly in all developed countries and many others. And the fact that we haven't been able to do something that we want to do and we know we ought to do, and we haven't been able to do this for, I mean, literally 100 years, is kind of embarrassing.
Alan, we lost your audio.
Oh, there we go again. I'm sorry. Now my video's gone out. Good grief. For some reason, we haven't felt compelled enough. I guess enough of us are comfortable with the system we have now, and we feel we're getting the benefits that we think we need. And we're not thinking of the people who are left behind. One of the things I talk about in my book, in the chapter on healthcare, is theories about what the best way of accomplishing something is. And there are many sociologists who contend that for many people, the best way of getting what they want is to get it for themselves, by themselves. And that actually working together to achieve something is more difficult, and but actually in the end is more likely to lead to success. And I think, you know, unfortunately, in the last 4 years, we've had a movement, I think, away from the idea that working together is the preferred mode of accomplishing greater things in our country and in our state. And we have to somehow get back to the commitment that healthcare especially is something we really got to get right. And we've really got to do it. This is something I'd still like to see in my lifetime, and clock is ticking.
So we also have Wendy who would like to ask a question. So I'm going to have her unmute in just a second and ask herself.
Yeah, hi, Alan, and especially I want to give a shout out to Deb Richter, who has fought so long and so hard at the state. And my concern about healthcare is I don't think it is a legal issue. I think it is a practical issue. When everybody talks about universal healthcare, they talk about insurance. And anybody who's on Medicare knows that if you don't have secondary insurance, you're dead in the water. It's going to cost you a fortune, and you're not going to get what you need. So I think the conversation should not be about access to insurance, but access to care. This is such a technical issue. Some of it is we have too small a pool in Vermont to make it financially feasible. Our major tertiary care, we only have one, University of Vermont. Most of the people, a lot of people go to Dartmouth, they go to Albany, they go to Bay State in Springfield. So immediately you're into negotiating with surrounding organizations. So I think it's a practice, and we don't have the body of expertise in the state. So I think that we really should shift our look at how do we make sure everybody has access to care, not insurance, and find a way to bolster those. And in the 17 years I've been here, the FQHC, which is the health center movement, has gone exponentially grown, mainly thanks to Bernie Sanders, where we actually now in rural areas have access to care. So I think it's such a technical issue that even if we put something in, we're still going to have the morass of how do we actually get the care? How do we reinsure it? So I just think that we've had the wrong emphasis. It should not be on just this legal, the right to care, which everybody agrees, I think, within Vermont. But how do we make it as a practicality happen? So people like Deb and the doctors who want to give the care, first of all, are not going to go broke financially, as almost every primary care doctor who's not with a hospital is going broke in this COVID situation. How do we make it possible for doctors to stay? How do we make a good loan program so that doctors get reimbursed to stay? So we have the providers, we have the location, and not get muddied in this universal notion of, oh, well, if we all have insurance, this is great, because it isn't going to work. So I've said my piece, that I don't think it is a legal issue. I think it is a very practical financial issue of how we make it happen. So I said my piece, now go mute.
So if I remember the statistic from an op-ed that Deb had in Vermont Digger earlier this week or last week, she was pointing out that even though 93% of Vermonters have health insurance, 40% of Vermonters are actually underserved, that they don't have adequate health coverage. And I think you're saying the same thing from a slightly different angle. But I think that's one of those problems that I hadn't really been thinking about myself, because I've thought, Vermont overall has made some amazing progress over the years. Can't we just push the last 3-5% and get ourselves up to where we ought to be? And the answer is no, it's actually more difficult than that, because there are still more holes than we realize. I also think what you said in the very beginning, that we're a small state, we're not a big pool, I do think that's a huge problem. And obviously, one solution would be if we all were covered under a national plan. I think that would be the best solution. I think the next best solution would be if we were to work as a geographic collection of states in the Northeast and band together to set up a regional healthcare system. I don't know how feasible that might be, although, it could be, depending on what happens in the election next month. States might be starting to look for new ways of doing business like that. I think something's going to happen, but I don't know what it is. I think the health situation is just becoming intolerable. And I think more people are realizing it. we just have to figure out the actions that can be taken to force what we know we should be doing. I mean, it really comes down to that. We have to do what we know we should be doing.
And I don't have any other questions in the chat yet, but I know they're usually kind of long. So if anybody also wants to just raise their hand this way too, we're happy to do that. Okay. A quiet group tonight, but that's okay. So I will repost the link if people are interested in purchasing Allen's book from us, Phoneix. And Todd, I don't know if you want to say a few things or if we want to have Allen say anything first before we kind of do the close.
Well, I just really wanted to thank Allen very much for making this happen tonight and for working with the Onion River Press to get this important book out into the marketplace. Thank everybody on the call for joining us via Zoom this evening. You know, one of the things that is maybe a silver lining in our situation, that since we can't meet in person, it does allow people that from many places to come together via electronics. So thanks everybody for coming and joining us. And Allen, did you want to end in any particular way?
Well, yeah, I actually had an idea this afternoon when I was thinking about what to say, and some of the comments tonight make me think this really is a good idea. I have a website that I set up for the book, equalisequal.com, and I've been trying to put little bits of content of the book up there, as well as, you know, where can you purchase the book and what events are coming up. But I think there ought to be a part of that website that's devoted to something like Educate for Equity. You know, that could be the title. That becomes sort of a place where you can get information and get research and opinions about issues in equity that are being talked about, discussed at this time. And clearly healthcare is one of them. And I was thinking, you know, if I had to put something up right away, I would put up a study. I believe it's from the Commonwealth Fund. That is Commonwealth Fund. It's about how is it that we spend so much and really get not all that much for what we do spend. We're not getting nearly the value that we should for what we put into healthcare. And I'd also put up Deb Richter's piece from that was published this past week, because that's one that's challenging whether OneCare is working as a solution for universal coverage for Vermonters. And I thought it was a terrific piece, and it should be read by a lot of people and taken seriously. So anyhow, I just want to thank everybody who came on the call, on the event tonight, the Zoom event tonight. If you have a slow connection, I feel your pain, because usually I do, and it's been better for me tonight. But thanks, and love to have you read the book. And if you ever want to comment to me, you can go on my website. My email address is right there, and you can scream at me or praise me or whatever you'd like to do. I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, Allen, thanks again. And thanks everybody for coming. And once again, Allen's book is available at phoenixbooks.biz or by calling any of our stores, and we can get it in your hands.
Thank you to the Phoneix Books crew.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and have a great night, and be safe out there. Thanks, Allen.